Hi, and welcome to episode 56 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
And today we're joined by Dr. Katie Hinde, who's an assistant professor at Harvard University in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. You want to say hi, Katie, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to do this. I am really interested in how socially complex mammals' early life environment influences how they become competent adults in both their physical abilities and their behavior. And I've really allocated most of my research effort to understanding the role of mother's milk in this developmental programming, just because, in part, it's been problematically, I think, understudied. A lot of developmental programming has looked at early fetal programming and what happens physiologically as fetuses, and then looked at maternal care after an infant's born as very influential. But that physiological investment continues over into the postnatal period, and milk has nutrients, it has hormones, it has immunofactors, and all of those can be quite important in ways that we still don't understand for infant development. Most of my research has been done in rhesus macaque monkeys, which are really just cool animals. But I've also worked with long-tailed macaques in Indonesia, starting to do research with human populations in different places, and collaborating with others on a number of different species. Most recently, we have a paper coming out on Monday about cows.
Oh, Morgan. I should have pressed the button.
just give a pause before you start, and Stephen can edit that.
So I was originally going to ask you first, why milk? Is it just to make mammals seem more interesting? But you kind of answered that already. So yeah, it's fine. It's fine. But as a sort of first question, how did milk evolve?
Well, that's a great question, and in many ways we don't really know. In part because the soft tissue of the mammary gland obviously doesn't fossilize, and so there's a lot of debate into what the original function of a mother's milk could have been. It's calculated that it started around 300 million years ago in synapsids, which were contemporary, or actually slightly older than dinosaurs, and they ended up evolving into therapsids and eventually mammals. And they were delivering little soft-shelled eggs that were kind of like turtle eggs on land, and there was some debate as to whether or not they had to stay hydrated. So some evolutionary lactation biologists argue that the first functional role of milk was to hydrate these eggs on land. Others that rely a lot on the genome and constituents in milk that are present across all living mammals, and some of the oldest genes for it are implicated in the immune factors in breast milk, or milk, right? Only humans have breast, but in milk. And so some argue that it was actually not for hydration, but to deliver antibodies across these soft-shelled eggs to enhance the survival of offspring. And so there's debate about what the original function was, but we do know that systematically across time that the function of milk has expanded to include, calories, we know it involves hydration and immunofactors, and now we're starting to understand more about bacteria that are present in milk or hormones in milk, and the diversity across mammals in the milks that they produce, and you can have two species that live in very similar ecologies but make very different milk. And you can have species that live in very different ecologies but make the same milk, and milk varies in some systematic ways, but we still don't completely understand it at all across species.
Cool. So you just said that you have a new paper coming out on Monday about cows, and
Yes.
This is testing some quite sort of well-developed evolutionary theory, right? Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yes. So I'll give a little bit of background. I'm really interested in how mothers allocate to young to maximize their fitness, and I, of course, am my work is, even though my degree is in anthropology, I'm very much an evolutionary anthropologist and evolutionary biologist, and I mean, classic area of research is how mothers invest in sons versus daughters. And the most famous hypothesis, I think, arguably in a lot of evolutionary theory, has to be the Travers-Willard hypothesis, and how mothers are predicted to allocate resources to sons or daughters in relation to their own condition and the benefit to the offspring. And you put in Travers-Willard into Google Scholar search, and you get back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles. And the data in those articles tends to be somewhat equivocal about the Travers-Willard hypothesis. Now, there's a handful of papers across different mammal species that show some differences in the milk that's synthesized for sons and daughters, right? And sometimes it supports the Travers-Willard hypothesis, and sometimes it doesn't. And one of the things that you run into is trying to understand, is it, this sex-biased milk is happening obviously after the offspring's been born, but functional development of the mammary actually occurs during pregnancy. So there's the potential that it's vulnerable to signals from the fetus. And I wrote a blog post on my blog, Mammal Suck, all about what we know about sex-biased milk synthesis, and I put it out there on Twitter. And a few weeks later, I got a direct message via Twitter from a dairy scientist. And he contacted me and he said, we could really unpack this prenatal versus postnatal influence on milk synthesis in a dairy cow, because the calves are born and then pulled from the mother. And then they're systematically milked in a standardized way. So any differences that emerge in their milk are going to reflect what might have been established during pregnancy. And what we found is that systematically across parities and using parity as a proxy for maternal condition, that systematically mothers are favoring daughters in milk synthesis. After gestating a daughter, a cow makes much more milk than after she gestates a son. And so the Travers-Willard hypothesis has multiple parts, but one of the key parts is that this investment should vary depending on maternal condition, and we don't find any evidence for that. It also assumes that in species where you would expect to have a lot of male-male competition, that mothers in better condition would favor sons. Now, we can expect that the ancestral species from which cows were domesticated, aurochs, which went extinct a few hundred years ago, that they probably had a lot of male-male competition, and so they fit a lot of the predicating assumptions of the Travers-Willard hypothesis. But we don't find evidence that these data are supporting the Travers-Willard hypothesis, and moreover, I think the data make us look really hard at whether or not these differences are due to adaptations that are operating in mothers, right? So it could be that mothers are somewhat vulnerable to infiltration of their physiology by the fetus. And so then the question becomes, are these adaptations that are operating in the fetus, and that fetal daughters can send signals that are, send hormones that amplify mammary gland production that fetal sons just can't do without serious consequences, right? So they could aromatize their testosterone and send estrogens to the mother, like a daughter, but that's going to have consequences for their gonadal development, is kind of the thinking. And so these data, because we had such a large data set, because we were able to look across parities within individual and look at these really complex interactions, we're really able to unpack the phenomena and say, all right, we don't know if it's an adaptation in mom. We don't know if it's an adaptation in young. We don't know if there's, mutually antagonistic adaptations that have co-evolved in mothers and young due to parent-offspring conflict. It could just be a constraint of the physiology of the placenta, and it really lets us look at this in lots of different ways and think about much harder why there might be differences in milk, where they originate from just mechanistically, and how selection might have shaped them. And it opens up a lot of areas for future research to look at this, and also consider that 7 other hypotheses about sex-biased investment other than Travers-Willard, which generally people are either unaware of or not pursuing, partly because there's some overlap with Travers-Willard, but sometimes there isn't. And so I think it affords us an opportunity to think harder and more broadly about these phenomena than just, are they favoring sons? Sorry, that was a really long explanation.
Well, you had 1.5 million cows in your data, right? So you're allowed to have a really long explanation for that.
Yeah, I mean, it was we had in the big data set we had 2.5 million lactations from it's 2.4 million lactations from 1.5 million cows. We then cleaned the data set and got it, because there's this confound, which really has driven a lot of conventional wisdom in the dairy industry. So the confound is that sons are more likely to have a difficult birth and cause dystocia, and we know that that is going to really significantly inhibit milk production during lactation. And we knew that, and so we got a data set, we cleaned it down, and we only got calves that had easy births and for whom we had information about both the first and second pregnancy for their mother, and that didn't have any kind of hormonal manipulation to amplify milk production. So with that data set, we had 13,000 cows that we just had all data to look at them across time. And what we found, and this is why these data add something beyond the dystocia conversation that really dominates dairy science. We found the same effect there as favoring of daughters in terms of more milk after gestating a daughter, but there's this interesting interaction between parities, right? So if a cow gives birth to a son and she's making milk on that first lactation after having gestated a son, and during that lactation she conceives a daughter, all of a sudden she produces more milk, right? So this is the subsequent fetus's sex, no dystocia involved, amplifying the milk that she's producing in an already established lactation.
Wow.
Similarly, the sex of the fetus you gestate on that first pregnancy feeds forward into the next pregnancy, right? So conceiving a daughter on pregnancy 1 means you make more milk on lactation 2, regardless of whether you're also carrying a son, which is supposed to be more costly for the mothers. And so this lets us know, I think, quite convincingly that the sex of the offspring during fetal development is exerting some kind of interesting influences on the development of the mammary gland architecture. Now, we need to do a lot more work, but I think that attributing this exclusively to dystocia or sons being bigger is an insufficient explanation for the data we're seeing.
So what's your next plan with this? I guess you can't just come up with another 1.5 million cow data set. But where are you going?
But apparently there are bigger dairy cow data sets out there that I've now heard about. And so I started making jokes that, like, I need to make a T-shirt that says I don't get out of bed for N less than 100,000, or something equally obnoxious. But, the areas of research that we're really expanding into we're interested in looking at what's going on with the mammary gland architecture that's allowing for this differential milk production. So that's one area. Another area is I'm really, really interested in how milk is influencing infant behavioral development. And that's really where a big portion of my research effort goes in rhesus monkeys. And this gets us, I have data, I've presented it at conferences, but it's not published yet. We're getting ready to submit the manuscript, so I'll just kind of hint at it right now. So half of the story, right, is that, okay, I'll use the cows as the example. The cows are making more milk for daughters, but we know that sons are bigger, and they grow bigger during calfhood, and infancy and calfhood as young. And so the question then becomes, how are they doing that? Right? If under naturalistic conditions cows would be making less milk for sons, why are they growing better? And then that means that we really need to look not just at what mothers are producing, but also at how the infants are utilizing these resources that they're getting from the mother. And what we're now looking at is the integration between the nutritional components of milk with the hormonal components of milk, specifically glucocorticoids, and looking at how those together are co-organizing growth trajectories and behavioral trajectories. And what we're finding, in some ways not surprisingly, is that the effects of mother's milk are different in sons and daughters. So even when milk's the same, the outcomes can be different. And this brings us back to, we can't just look at the infant as this passive consumer of mother's milk, and that they're, that they don't have their own agenda and agency in their developmental trajectories, because we know they do. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to think about, the Travers-Willard hypothesis. A lot of times they're measuring infant outcomes to assess maternal effort and investment. Well, that's an imperfect measure, because it's being mediated through an organism that is allocating resources according to their own agenda, not necessarily their mother's. And then I'm also really interested in humans. And we're looking at different constituents in mother's milk that vary across human populations depending on the nutritional ecology and the disease ecology that the mothers are living in and rearing their young. Babies. Humans are babies.
So what I'm getting from all of this pretty much is that babies are kind of jerks and have their own agendas, hidden agendas, and are influencing those poor parents into doing what the hell they want. Well,
although, it's not that there aren't counter adaptations potentially inherent, right? So I think it's that there's shared agenda and then there's divergent agenda. And they are continuously being negotiated between parents and young, and anybody that's ever dealt with a weaning tantrum knows exactly what I am talking about. and I mean, it's one of those things where it's a complex feedback system, and it's quite elegant and lovely, but very challenging to study sometimes, because it's hard, because like even, if infants are influencing milk and mothers are influencing milk, and you're measuring milk, how do you know where mothers begin and end and babies begin and end? And so it's one of the reasons why it's really nice to start branching out into animal science models, because they just have a lot of data, and it affords us opportunities to look at the system in different ways than I can with monkeys or wild living animals, and because there's so many open questions and it's so complex.
Yeah, I imagine all your collaborators and colleagues in the field of milk biology are probably looking at you with a little bit of side eye now that you're saying that the first pregnancy is influencing the second pregnancy's lactation, and thus introducing another compounding variable.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I get to side eye a lot. I remember when I first started graduate school, I had this idea that I was going to go and do night observations. Okay, I was going to do night observations of primates to look at nursing behavior, because a lot of nursing behavior happens at night, and I'd slept. Before I went to grad school, I went into the field season in Indonesia, and I slept on the beach underneath the trees where the monkeys slept, and a little bit adjacent, because otherwise it's messy. And and I remember they'd wake me up all the time, because they'd have all these kerfuffles in the middle of the night, or there'd be a fight, or it'd be raining, and they'd be, grumpy, and then they'd wake up in the morning and they'd have colds, and just like people, like they have bad nights of sleep, but they're really social at night. And I discovered that, oh my gosh, they don't just go to sleep and stop behaving and stop doing things. And I remember telling my advisor how I thought there could be some really exciting things going on at night, and I had I found a citation where somebody had taken a rowboat and gotten night vision goggles and gone around Cayo Santiago down in Puerto Rico and done night observations of rhesus monkeys. And I totally think we should do this. And I remember my advisor, her advice was, no, you can't do that. One, you'll either replicate what we already know from daytime observations, or you'll find out that nighttime's totally different and matters more, and that everybody needs to start doing night observations too, and everybody will hate you.
Did you go for option 2?
Yeah, so she gave me very, very good advice for my planning to not, throw a giant wrench in the works. But I mean, I think yes, first parity is something that's going to matter, and that there could be these complex feed forward and feedback things, but any evolutionary biologist already knows. They already know that, right? No reproductive event occurs in a vacuum from what has come before or what is going to come after. I mean, that's fundamental life history theory. We can black box it away when we do our studies, but fundamentally we always know it's there. So it's nice to start getting some data in sample sizes big enough that you can actually detect how these reproductive events are actually influencing one another.
So I was just wondering, you were saying earlier about the sort of ancestral social structures of the cows that you're looking at, and obviously with the macaques and things like this, then there are weird, complex social structures going on. So how does that affect how you approach things?
Yes, that's a really good question, and so in many ways, what's interesting is the rhesus macaques are known for having a very, very linear, very nepotistic, very despotic social hierarchy. And but I work with them in captivity, so they all have ample access to food resources. So the energy intake is seemingly pretty standardized across the different lineages or matrilines within a social group. But the psychosocial stress is still there, because even though they're not necessarily fighting over food as much as they would under different ecological conditions, high-ranking females still make it very clear that they are high-ranking and displace lower-ranking females pretty big. We haven't yet systematically found a strong signature of rank in mother's milk among captive primates that we've looked at. In the wild, we could potentially, especially in terms of micronutrients and access to preferred foods. I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that rank is going to be most noticeable when times are tough, right? Because that's when you find that there's going to be differences in resource availability and differences in the degree of conflict between individuals. And until we have more information about wild living primates' milk, I think we're going to have a harder time really understanding how the signature of rank is showing up in milk. It might be there in terms of glucocorticoids. It might be there in different ways. But for in captivity, we're not seeing it. But I don't necessarily mean that it wouldn't be there in other circumstances.
Yeah, I think I saw on your website that you're looking at doing some stuff with meerkats.
Yes.
So is that similar? Are they all kind of, everything's very nice and they all have the same amount of resources, or is it a bit more competitive?
No, and we're looking to do this with Tim Pluttenbrock and Christy McLeod, and they, I mean, obviously they're the meerkat experts. What you find there, and one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting with meerkats is that, and there's some papers coming out on this in humans too. So some of the work I've done has shown that hormones in mother's milk are important for programming behavior. And we tend to think of milk as being vertically transmitted between mother and offspring. But there are a number of species in which milk is transferred obliquely from another female to an infant. So like an allo mother, or historically wet nurses and other species. In other species, they have allo nursing and things like that. And so then the question becomes, what happens to those infants or young that are getting hormonal signals from multiple females, especially lower-ranking females that have that their allo-parenting role is how they gain access to social group living, right? And so that's going to characterize meerkats. So you generally usually only have one breeding female, and other females in the group are known to let her pup suckle. And so then the question becomes what kind of milk are they producing, and how might it be influencing those little meerkats? But we haven't yet launched that study yet. It's one of those things where, as per typically, we're waiting for funding. But I think that's going to be a really, really interesting question. Right? And looking at, even if there are, like, okay, so you get all these glucocorticoids from a low-ranking female, and it changes the behavioral phenotype, you got a whole bunch of extra milk, and maybe that enhances survival, and it's a worthwhile trade-off that it's going to be favored. So, empirically, it's an open question.
I have a stupid question now. Is it only mammals that produce milk?
Why no, Tom? It's not.
Sweet. Tell me more.
It's very clear that males are the best in all ways about producing milk. So, I have to get in my mammal big while I can. There are other species that make milk. So it's found in birds. So you've got pigeon milk or flamingo milk or penguin milk, which is in their crop. They start shedding this white, chunky, cottage cheese-like substance that is very similar to milk in mammals in that it has nutrients, it has hormones, it has vitamins, it has some bacteria and some immunofactors. And particularly in pigeons, it seems to be the most developed insofar as squabs, which is apparently the term for pigeon chicks, squabs.
If you've ever seen a baby pigeon, then that's pretty appropriate. They're
okay. I'm not. But they obligatorily need to consume this pigeon milk, right? And it's for the first few weeks, and the pigeon milk has a lactation curve, so they make more of it during peak pigeon lactation, and the composition changes across time, and both the father and the mother are shedding this stuff, and little squab sticks its head down their throat and eats out all this chunky white milk. So that's a nutritious substance that's made. Discus fish, they secrete this kind of mucousy, nutritious stuff that the little fry eat along their sides, so they can get nourishment that way. And then I think the most interesting example of milk, actually outside of mammals, comes from insects. And so it's kind of a Russian nesting doll kind of story. So you have bats, right, the mammal bat, and they have these ectoparasites, which are called bat flies. And they're obligatory ectoparasites, and they have to stay on the bat, and they get all of their nourishment from drinking bat blood. But they don't get all of the vitamins they need from that blood, so they have these commensal bacteria who, upon digesting bat blood, then turn it into bioactive vitamins for that ectoparasite host. And so the ectoparasite host actually makes milk inside itself for its larva and give birth to larvae inside itself, and has this milky substance in their uterus, and the larvae eat the milky substance and acquire this bacteria internally in their bat fly mother, and then hatch alive and are on a bat and then transfer to another bat in the roost, rookery, whatever they call where bats live.
Milk is much cooler and even grosser than I realized.
Yeah, it's something that I deal with so often that I kind of forget, like, stepping back and being like, so
have you tasted every type of milk that you've worked with?
No.
Come on.
No. So, first of all, I work with rhesus monkeys, and the zoonotic disease transmission potential there, even if it wasn't a violation of every single, like, OSHA requirement on the planet, like, I don't need rules to keep me from doing it. There's no way.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't be that happy if they came in and you were just milking a tiny macaque into a cup.
I'm making Reese's cheeses, you guys. Like, it's totally cool. Not gonna do it. I've had cow's milk and sheep milk and goat milk, and so basically only things that are domesticated and regulated.
That's reasonable.
Yeah, I'm not even. I really like cheese and I really like ice cream, but it's not like I have a big steamy glass of milk in the morning or anything like that.
You should really do that for any time that you have a prospective student coming.
Take them out for big glasses of milk.
Yeah, just have a big bucket on your desk. Just be like, help yourself.
Yeah. I'll bring it in a pail. Like, I'll just have a pail of milk there. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So, just to finish off, I can see that in the background you have subtly positioned a poster for a forthcoming public symposium. So, can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I also do want to talk about Mammal March Madness just a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So there's the Carta Institute, which is the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropology. It's in San Diego. In a few weeks, they're having a symposia all about anthropological perspectives of the human life cycle, and really looking at from birth until grandmotherhood, what we know cross-culturally, evolutionarily, psycho-bio, developmentally, and I get to be there and give the milk components of the talks, and it's online. It's gonna be streaming, much like Breaking Bio, and I get to talk, but like you really should tune in because Sarah Hurdy's talking, and Kristen Hawkes, and Mel Connor and Hilly Kaplan, and just really like all the people that like I was in awe of them as an undergrad, but I'm even more in awe of them as a grown-up academic. So it'll be a really, really nice set of talks.
So I guess we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. So where can people follow along with your research, and where can they find March Mammal Madness when it comes time for the throwdown?
So the best ways are to put an RSS feed on my blog, Mammal Suck Milk. So just do a Google search for Mammal Suck, and my blog comes up first. And they can follow me on Twitter at Mammal Suck. And that's kind of where I put out stuff from my research and announce different things with Mammal March Madness. And it's also, I tweet a lot and blog a lot about other people's research, because there's so much different. Lactation biologists are working at genetic levels, molecular levels, whole like cross mammal analyses, and there's so much research that's going on that I report a lot of it, even whether I'm involved in it or not. I think it's nice to kind of bring it all together and have a place where people can go and find out about why mammals suck and how amazing milk is.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on to Breaking Bio this week and for joining us. And for everybody listening at home, you can find us online as well. You can find us at Breaking Bio on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. And, of course, you can check all of our old episodes on the blog at breakingbio.com. So for this week, I want to say thanks to Katie and Tom for joining us, and I hope every mammal that's sucking at home is going to join us next week.
All right, have a good one. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Katie.
Bye.